Today I have Graham Cook here, and he's very kindly going to tell us all about St Wulfram's and the Save the Spire appeal. He is the church architect for St Wulfram's, so I'm going to hand you over to Graham now.
Thank you, Jean. Yes, I've been the architect for St Wulfram's Church for a number of years now. We only recently discovered a serious problem with the stonework at the top of the spire. We had thought it was in quite good condition for reasons which I will explain later, so it has come as somewhat of a shock. The medieval spire stood happily for many years, and the first recorded incident we know of a major problem with the spire was that in 1797 the top of the spire was apparently blown off in a gale. It was rebuilt in a somewhat hasty way, we gather, by putting a millstone on top. Presumably they didn't have the money to do a proper job to rebuild it at that time. We don't then know exactly what happened until 1884, when Aldred Scott, who was the architect for the church at the time, who was the son of Scott who did the major restoration of the church in the 1860s. Aldred Scott rebuilt the top of the spire in the form that we see it today, but not with the stones that we see today, for reasons which I will explain. That spire then sat there happily until the Second World War, and during the war, Lawrence Bond, who was the architect for the church at the time, was away abroad in the army. And while he was away, the cathedral architect at the time took on the care of St Wulfram's and did the surveys and inspections. He discovered during the war that there were cracks in the top of the stonework at the top of the spire, and he estimated that the top 40 feet of the spire was going to need rebuilding. There was no money obviously to do that during the war. There wasn't much money around when Lawrence Bond came back from the war, but they had a national appeal, they raised a lot of money, and were able to scaffold the whole of the tower and spire to do the repairs at the top. And there are photographs which people have seen, I'm sure, of that episode when the tower was all scaffolded. What they discovered in 1946 was that the top 16 feet had to be rebuilt, but 24 feet below that looked to them in fairly sound condition actually, and apart from replacing a few stones, they decided to leave that 26 feet. The reason the top 16 feet had to be rebuilt is to do with the method by which spires are constructed. They basically are a hollow shell. They have a 6-inch thick, average 6-inch thick stone wall in the form of a cone, but the top section of the spire, because it's much smaller, would easily blow around and be disturbed in strong winds. So the top section of spire is always clamped together with metal bands or metal rods and crossbars lower down in the spire, so that everything is tightened up and compressed. The top acts as one big mass of stone which is resistant to wind forces. That's the way most spires are built. Of course, that relies on a metal rod going down through the middle, and there are records of spires being weighted at the top with hanging weights, but we don't know of any examples of that still existing, and I suspect it was a rather dangerous way of doing it because the support for the weight could easily fail with obvious disastrous results. So it was only really when ironwork became more readily available they started putting in proper holding down rods. In the 1946 rebuilding, the holding down rod which had been put in either in 1884 or an earlier rebuild had rusted to the extent that it was splitting the stone and causing disturbance at the top. So in 1946 that 16 feet at the top of the spire was rebuilt. The finial stone was a newly designed finial stone by Lawrence Bond, for which we have the drawings, and the vane rod, the weather vane at the top, which is the one still there, which is incidentally 10 feet high from top to bottom, which nobody can quite believe. That was gilded and put on, and that sat there happily. Everybody thought that was fine. The last time we had steeplejacks up the spire was in the 1990s. They found no problems and gave it a clean bill of health. So when we came to do a survey last year, we decided we ought to take the precaution of having another look. And the steeplejack looked from ground level and said he, with binoculars, couldn't see any real problems. Unfortunately, when he got up there on ladders, he discovered that there were cracks appearing in one or two places which concerned him. So at that stage, we put in a scaffold platform through the top level spire-like windows, which is still there at the moment and can be seen. And that enabled us to get up inside and have a good look at the inside masonry. There we discovered that there were a lot of iron cramps which had now started to rust and expand and split the stone and lift joints. And this was starting to become a serious problem, because we now were, instead of having a pile of stones bonded together with mortar and clamped together with the metal rods, we now were starting to get loosening of the joints and therefore a potential problem with wind forces on the spire. This was in late autumn 2011, and we involved a structural engineer who's a specialist on spires and is also happy climbing ladders. So he came up and had a look, and he went away to do a computer simulation of the forces and the resistance of the spire. He then came back to us in some alarm because he had calculated that the factor of safety for the top of the spire in wind speeds of 100 miles an hour was just over 1. In other words, it was only just safe. This left us with some problems. So the structural engineer got together with the steeplejacks and they rapidly inserted a mesh of scaffold poles inside, bolted to the inner faces of stones, to stiffen everything up and brace it together. That was all we had time to do before Christmas 2011, but that rendered it safe. We then put in some more elaborate bracing on the outside of the spire after Christmas to clamp everything onto this structure which is inside. That has now made it perfectly safe for the time being. It will resist all wind speeds we know of at the moment. But of course it can't be left like that, and it's costing money all the time because it needs to be checked regularly to make sure it's still tight and safe, and the boards aren't loose, and all the other health and safety risks which are enormous at such height, of course. So we've applied for a grant initially from English Heritage, who, if they will help, will be one of the main grant givers. We've got through the initial stages of that. During the application went in June. We had a visit from their architect who was sympathetic to the problems and encouraging to us. We're looking at over £500,000 project, and we would hopefully get a chunk of that from English Heritage, but we will have other money to raise, and we will have to apply for other grants and do everything we can to get the money together. It's still an enormous target. A lot of people are puzzled by the level of cost, but it's the problem is, of course, that everything takes so much longer to do up at high level. The reason that we've got all this problem in the lower part of the spire is that the 16 feet that was rebuilt in 1946 is still perfectly sound. There's nothing wrong with that. And that was rebuilt with a bronze rod. But there is another 26 feet which they did initially have concerns about during the war, but felt they were okay, where we've now discovered rusting iron cramps. Those we think were put in 1797. So we've got to take down the whole of that 26 feet, the lower 26 feet, and to do that we have to dismantle the top, 24 feet, and we have to dismantle the top 16 feet to get at it.
That's an enormous job, isn't it?
So it is a big job, and we fear that we're going to lose a lot of the stone in the 24 feet which has the cramps in, because the cramps will have rusted to the extent where they will have split the stones, set up a weakness in the stone, and we can't reliably reuse them. If we're lucky, we will be able to reuse stones, but we won't know until we can do a bit more investigation, and then we really won't know until we take it apart. The way the grant process will work is that if we're awarded an English Heritage grant, we will then have the whole of 2013 to do further investigations, obtain approvals, which are quite a complex matter for a job like this, and get a specification agreed, get competitive tenders in, and agree a price for the job and a contractor for the job. We won't be able to do the work until 2014 because of the exposed position of the spire, obviously right up there, and the fact that we've got to work with lime mortar, the traditional material which it would have been built originally. We can't do that work in cold months, so we have to start the work in the spring when it starts to warm up, and put in a full campaign, as we would call it, to get the work finished by the late autumn of that year, which will be 2014. 2013 will also obviously be spent trying to raise the rest of the money, or borrow. So that's the sort of timetable. The stone we use will almost certainly be Ancaster stone from one of the quarries at Ancaster. That was the stone the spire would have been built from originally. Interestingly, the top 16 feet, when it was rebuilt in just after the war, was rebuilt using Clipsham stone from Northamptonshire, because at that time the stone coming from Ancaster Quarry was not reliable. It was a poor bed. However, we are now in a very good, strong bed of Ancaster, so that's what we will revert to for the new stone. We hope the top 16 feet will come apart and go back together again without much loss of stone. One other thing we're working around is the peregrine falcons who use the top of the tower to bring up their young every year. Well, they have for the last few years, and for which there's a camera in the church, which people may have seen, which gives you a live view of them as they grow up. Their breeding period at the beginning of the year will obviously clash with our building period in 2014, and we will have to negotiate with the relevant authorities that they are moved somewhere else that year, or that the nest box is not put up that year. But 2013 and hopefully the year after the rebuild in 2015, they will be able to carry on using their present roost.
Goodness, there's such a lot that you've got to take into consideration, isn't there? I hadn't thought about the peregrines, but that's...
yes, well, of course, they're protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act to an extent, except, of course, that they're only there by permission because the box is put up for them. So we do have a slightly stronger case, and I think it's generally accepted that they have to be moved for the 1 year so that we can rebuild the spire. There's a problem that has to be tackled.
Well, thank you very much. It's very complex and very involved, and thank you for explaining all of this to us, Graham. It's a great help, and I'm sure a lot of people will be really interested. And also, it's hopefully, if they're really interested, they will help in any small way to contribute towards the raising of funds.
That would be wonderful. There is a Spire website which people can visit. There are links to it from the St Wulfram's website, but it's savegranhamspire.co.uk.
That's useful. Thank you very much. And the people who are local will obviously know about the appeal, and let's hope they'll all contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you.